HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Kent State, an American Tragedy by Brian Vandemark. Read by Daniel Henning. Prologue. People don't withhold the whole truth unless the whole truth is too much to bear. For years, he didn't tell people the whole truth, not even his wife. He knew, of course, that he should tell the whole truth, but he always hesitated. His decision initially reflected the danger of legal jeopardy, then the burden of personal responsibility. Telling the whole truth would lead only to harsh criticism and endless speculation about his motives, and he had no desire to deal with either. And he failed to see how it would benefit the victims. Critics couldn't punish him any worse than he had punished himself. He had spent years in pain, reliving memories of the shooting. Vivid and disturbing, they resurfaced unpredictably, flickering like fish in murky waters. They haunted him, but he could not switch them off. They magnified what he withheld, but it was its very smallness that made it so terrible. Whenever he thought about the victims, it was about what went through their minds in their last seconds, all the things they would never do, their devastated families. Reporters, investigators, and historians did question him, at first every day, then every few weeks, then every year or so around the anniversary of the shooting. But he never told anyone exactly what happened. He convinced himself that this had been the right decision, and he did not see how reversing the decision would serve any useful purpose. He was an introspective man who spent a lot of time alone, pondering what happened. It had worn a deep groove in his mind. But no matter how controlled a person is, keeping a secret gets heavy and tiring and lonely. He could only hold out for so long. He sought relief from the heavy burden that had dogged him for decades. He wasn't happy about going over all of it again, but he had reached a certain age. The past few years had not been good ones for him. He had undergone 2 serious heart operations and felt he needed to get something off his chest that he had been holding back, make peace with things, and correct the historical record before it was too late. He wanted a clear conscience and an end to the tension. He hoped he would feel better, but he could just as easily end up feeling worse. "Enough time has passed," he told me. A long silence followed. "I'm willing now to talk with you about it. I'm going to tell you only the truth. I'm not afraid of what's down the pike." It was the only story about the Kent State shooting that nobody but him would ever be able to tell. Matt McManus was a 25-year-old platoon sergeant in Company A, 1st Battalion, 145th Infantry Regiment of the Ohio Army National Guard on May 4, 1970. The 11th of 12 children, he was orphaned when 5 years old and never adopted. He joined the Guard at 18 and became a leader among the enlisted Guardsmen. He was intelligent and confident. He liked his men, and they liked him, and he was firm but kind. But for more than 50 years, he withheld exactly what happened at Kent State University shortly after noon on that sunny, breezy spring day. The events that led to the death of 4 students and the wounding of 9 others during a protest against the Vietnam War. He came to think of May 4th as a separate, private world that he guarded against all kinds of inconvenient questions. His elusiveness wasn't readily apparent because it had been cultivated to such a degree that it became almost invisible. There were some things he would discuss only in the abstract. He avoided others so subtly one hardly noticed him doing it. When I wrote him to request an interview, his wife opened the letter and told him, "If you read this, you know there will be sleepless nights." But he read my letter and responded with an 8-page letter of his own. He agreed to talk with me, but he wanted a face-to-face discussion because it's best to look into one's eyes and feel the pain he or she may be experiencing. It's because of what I saw that I hate to go back to that day, he told me in a phone call a few days later. My mind goes back to an incident that I'd prefer not to remember, but that I can't forget. A long pause. We need to remember the students who died and were wounded that day, he then said. 3 weeks later, I traveled to his home in Wooster, Ohio. A part of me feared that he would change his mind at the last minute. My hopes lifted as I drove up and saw him standing in the street, waiting for me. The autumn sky above him was heavy with cold clouds. He had a sad face and looked exhausted, not the kind of exhaustion that can be healed by a good night's sleep. His burden showed in the lines of his face as he led me into the living room of his modest ground-floor apartment and took an easy chair opposite me, his hands on the chair arms. His wife sat on a sofa between us. There was something enormous moving through the air of that room. As I placed my tape recorder on the coffee table, he gave me a brief measuring look. He unfolded and refolded his hands, not wary of me, but being careful. I sensed how rigid with tension his body was. I could feel him thinking, and I didn't want to interrupt. He was gearing up toward something big. He took his time before he finally started to talk. As the interview got underway, he slowly loosened up. His initial reserve and bodily tension gradually fell away. For the next 2.5 hours, he unburdened himself completely about Kent State for the first time, narrating his way to the very soul of his regret. Much of the time he looked at me, but his haunted eyes never quite met mine. His mouth quivered often, and grief stirred under his voice. Occasionally, he cast his eyes at the floor or stared out the window, concentrating on something only he could see, shut away in a private world of thought. Waves of sadness crossed his face. He never dreamed that his action might not do what it was intended to do, that his fellow guardsmen might not react the way he anticipated, that with good intentions he could set in motion a terrible tragedy. But there was no undoing what happened, no fixing it or explaining it away. I wondered how many times he had rerun that day in his head. The pain in his voice went so deep that I had to force myself not to look away. It was a long postponed catharsis, painful but purgative. Deep down, a part of him felt relieved at last. But I couldn't tell which one was strongest, the relief or the shame. It wasn't over and done with. It was never going to be over and done with for him. Much of what Matt McManus told me was unexpected, yet it fit the known facts and was crucial to understanding how and why the shooting happened. Things that had baffled people for years suddenly made perfect sense. It also laid to rest many myths surrounding the events at Kent State. It was as if things suddenly rearranged themselves and clicked neatly into place, making visible what had been obscured for so long. I thought of the victims and their families. They needed to know, to understand. Cause and effect isn't a luxury. When we can't see a reason, we make assumptions and force facts into preconceived patterns until a reason takes shape because we want to find sense in the senseless. It is a reminder that reality is tumultuous, disordered, and unpredictable, and that learning the truth can be devastating. On May 4th, 1970, on the campus of Kent State University in northeastern Ohio, the cultural and political cross-currents that had been building in the United States for years reached critical mass. One group of young Americans, student protesters wearing bell-bottom pants and many with long hair, hurled epithets and rocks at another group of young Americans, National Guardsmen wearing helmets and gas masks and armed with rifles. At about noon, a spasm of violence unfolded with chaotic speed as the National Guardsmen opened fire on the protesters. This was the day the Vietnam War came home, and the 60s came to an end. American soldiers shot American students on American soil. The Kent State shooting was a shocking event that dramatized the tension of social conflict, the theater of confrontation, the poignancy of life and death, and the horror of pure chance, revealing the choices individuals make, those that are made for them by others, and their lifelong ramifications. The Kent State shooting gave rise to two competing narratives that oversimplified the motives and characters of the people involved, lacked nuance, and ignored ambiguity, complexity, unpredictability, confusion, chaos, and cruel pathos. One narrative depicted the shooting as lethal violence in the name of the state directed against those who sought to defy its writ. The other narrative depicted the shooting as law enforcement giving troublemakers the comeuppance they deserved. For more than 50 years, little to no middle ground has existed between these competing narratives. Opinions remain as sharply drawn as ever. Most Americans, when they look at Kent State, have not allowed themselves to understand the opposing viewpoint or to accept shared responsibility. Because of these competing narratives, and because of incomplete and sometimes contradictory evidence, the full story of the Kent State shooting has remained elusive. But now, the time has come to move beyond the partisanship of competing narratives. This means telling the story of the fatal encounter between Vietnam War protesters and the National Guard at Kent State through multiple perspectives, critically, and with understanding, but without taking sides. It means searching out and piecing together the story in all its intimate, vivid, and painful detail from previously published accounts, untapped archival documents, and original interviews with participants. Only then can one grasp the full dimensions of this great American tragedy and perhaps help to heal the wounds it inflicted. Chapter 1. The Divided America of 1970. Unraveling the full story of Kent State requires understanding what the shooting grew out of, what emotions and antagonisms brought it forth. Young Americans in 1970 came of age during a tumultuous era. They entered their teens when John F. Kennedy fell victim to an assassin amidst a bloody civil rights struggle in the South, which was followed by a succession of shocks: escalation of the Vietnam War, urban riots, and the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. World War II had been a talismanic paradigm for them as youngsters growing up during the 1950s. Television shows and movies made the war appear heroic and romantic. There were good guys and bad guys, and the Americans were always the good guys. The business of killing and being killed seemed sanitized and safe, just like in movies and on television. The U.S. military always did right, it always overcame adversity, and it always prevailed in the end. The Cold War was widely seen as a Manichaean struggle between American virtue and communist evil. These idealized notions collided during the 1960s with the messy realities of Vietnam. A war had been underway there since 1946, initially between the Vietnamese and their French colonial occupiers, then between communists in the north, supported by the Soviet Union and China, and anti-communists in the south, supported by the United States. In 1961, President Kennedy began sending increasing numbers of American military advisors to South Vietnam to shore up the declining fortunes of its autocratic leader, Ngo Dinh Diem. The 1963 coup that resulted in Ziem's death worsened circumstances in the fragile, troubled country. This led JFK's successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, to vastly expand U.S. involvement to avert South Vietnam's collapse. In 1965, LBJ initiated the bombing of North Vietnam and committed American combat troops to South Vietnam, the first steps in what would become a massive and futile U.S. military effort. Vietnam was America's first and last uncensored war. Television brought its violent realities into living rooms, making the ugly, obscene truth of war, death, and destruction concrete and emotionally immediate. Young Americans saw U.S. soldiers dying in jungles and rice paddies, and the American military unleashing a torrent of devastation on the people and countryside of Southeast Asia. The bloodshed shocked and angered those whose childhood had been sanitized and idyllic. Many of the ideals and illusions that baby boomers had been raised with began to fall away with astonishing speed. There was another reason for young Americans' discontent. Up until 1965, U.S. involvement in Vietnam had been limited, as had conscription quotas. Now, draft calls increased dramatically because LBJ elected to fight the war with draftees rather than reservists. College students received draft deferments, the 2S sanctuary, as long as they did not fail their courses or drop out. The potential loss of deferment status made students feel vulnerable, and witnessing the poor, the working-class kids, and the farm boys going to Vietnam in their place uneased them. These anxieties fed resistance to the draft. During 1964, not a single protest against the draft occurred. During 1965 and 1966, draft calls rose to 40,000 a month. During 1967 and 1968, anti-draft demonstrations took place at nearly half of all universities. Some of those involved in these demonstrations would develop a hatred for the military and everything associated with it. The first protests against the Vietnam War were polite affairs involving a few hundred marchers carrying signs back and forth in front of the White House. Most of the young men wore ties, and most of the young women wore skirts. As 1965 went on, the number of protesters grew. 15,000 in Washington in April, 20,000 in New York in October, and the rhetoric heated up. On college campuses, teach-ins exposed the growing rift between the left and the right. At Rutgers, in New Jersey, a history professor declared, "I do not fear or regret the impending Viet Cong, South Vietnamese communist guerrillas, victory in Vietnam. I welcome it." This prompted a sharp letter of reply to the New York Times. The victory for the Viet Cong, which Professor Genovese welcomes, would mean, ultimately, the destruction of freedom of speech for all men, for all time, not only in Asia but in the United States as well. Any individual employed by the state should not be allowed to use his position for the purpose of giving aid and comfort to the enemies of the state. The writer was future Republican President Richard Nixon. During 1966, the anti-war movement grew larger and louder as casualties mounted. Students protested the presence of Reserve Officers Training Corps, ROTC, units on college campuses. Some refused to register for the draft, to accept deferment or exemption, or to be inducted, which meant the possibility of jail or exile. Others urged draftees not to report and soldiers not to re-enlist, even to desert. Still, others organized mass registrations of conscientious objectors in order to jam the system. The Selective Service System retaliated by ordering local boards to reclassify draft resistors 1A, most eligible for conscription. In October 1967, nearly 70,000 college and high school students gathered near the Lincoln Memorial in Washington for a massive anti-war demonstration. The difference in atmosphere from the 1963 Civil Rights March on Washington, when Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his stirring "I Have a Dream" speech in the same spot, reflected the dramatic change in national mood provoked by Vietnam in just 4 years. Protesters carried a forest of placards, some reading, "Get the hell out of Vietnam," and "Where's Oswald when you need him?" One participant lauded the responsible people who thought enough to come down here in a show of protest, then nervously added, "I just hope to God the whole day stays this way." Following several speeches, including one by a speaker who declared that violence will not come from us, a smaller group of about 20,000 protesters streamed over Memorial Bridge toward the Pentagon, the heart of America's war machine. As the late afternoon sun cast a lengthening shadow, about 3,000 of the most radical demonstrators, chanting, "Hell no, we won't go," and denouncing white honky cops, surged toward the steps of the Pentagon's Mall Terrace entrance in an attempt to storm the belly of the beast. In front of the steps, a line of 300 white-helmeted U.S. Marshals with nightsticks and military police armed with rifles and tear gas grenades confronted the loud and jeering demonstrators, some of whom were carrying Viet Cong and North Vietnamese flags, brandishing sticks and shoving against the line. Amidst an exchange of fists and clubs, 24 demonstrators crashed through the line and sprinted toward an auxiliary entrance where soldiers inside forced them out with rifle butts. U.S. Marshals intercepted and beat the demonstrators as they came out, spattering the Pentagon steps with blood. Back at the line, demonstrators shouted obscenities, spit in soldiers' faces, taunted them. "Hit them, they won't hit back," yelled one protester, threw bottles and rocks, and urinated on the side of the building. It is difficult to report publicly the ugly and vulgar provocation of many of the militants, wrote James Reston in the New York Times. Other demonstrators placed flowers in soldiers' rifle barrels in what became an iconic image of the anti-war movement. The day ended on a tragic note. Most of the demonstrators left by nightfall, but a few thousand decided to camp overnight on the plaza in front of the Mall Terrace entrance, where they built bonfires out of wooden barricades they had broken through, lit draft cards that burned like fireflies in the night, and continued to taunt and curse soldiers and military police with self-righteous invective, while some female protesters unbuttoned their blouses and pawed at soldiers' zippers under the glare of floodlights the military had wheeled up to illuminate the plaza. Around midnight, after most reporters had left and network television cameras had been turned off, meaning the country wasn't watching, U.S. Marshals, backed by troops of the U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division, moved in a wedge toward the remaining demonstrators and began clearing the plaza. At this point, some U.S. Marshals who had been rapping their nightsticks against their hands, and soldiers who had been glaring at protesters, began brutally clubbing demonstrators, including young women whose faces were soon covered with raw skin and blood. The midnight beatings and the arrests that followed enraged the protesters who endured and witnessed them. "Something happened to many of us there that is hard to describe, harder to explain," a demonstrator observed. "We went down to protest and returned ready to resist. Many who were not anti-government now are. Many who were committed to using legal channels to change governmental policy now have what they consider the governmental attitude, cynicism, violence, covertness, which they may use for the same end. Reason is starting to slip, and like the inmates of concentration camps who gradually took on the values of their oppressors, I feel many are beginning to see violence as the only alternative to futile discussion." The anti-war movement's fury at the government and military intensified dramatically, feeding its growing sense of apocalypse in national life, with consequences that would become apparent in the years to come as anti-war protesters became more radical and prone to violence. Yet the March on the Pentagon had the opposite effect of that intended by its organizers. A Harris survey the following month revealed that 70% of Americans felt the march had hurt the anti-war cause, and a nearly equal number viewed it as an act of disloyalty to American servicemen in Vietnam. Nevertheless, nearly 60% of the public still supported demonstrations against the war as long as they remained peaceful. In late January 1968, Vietnamese communists launched the massive Tet Offensive. Casualties on both sides of the conflict skyrocketed. Demonstrations erupted at universities across the United States. The most notorious one began on a cool, gray April day at Columbia University in New York City. Using bullhorns to harangue the crowd, protest leaders wearing jeans and berets raised their fists and demanded Columbia sever ties with the Institute for Defense Analyses, a university consortium for military research, and cease construction of a gymnasium in Morningside Park that would be closed to African American residents of Harlem, chanting, "Jim Crow must go." Students took hostage a college dean and ransacked the president's office in Low Memorial Library, breaking into his files and urinating in his wastebasket. Low and 4 other buildings became liberated zones. During the occupation, polls showed a large majority of the campus to be against the protesters. University faculty asked the protesters whether they would abide by a university referendum on whether to end the strike. The protesters responded, "We believe in democracy. We will abide by the results of a vote. As long as the people of Vietnam and Harlem can vote too, since it is their lives that are most affected by these decisions." News media headquartered in Manhattan reported the events at Columbia around the country and the world. The takeover ended 7 days later when the university ordered in police to evict its own students, further radicalizing protesters. About 700 were arrested and more than 150 injured. Excesses occurred on both sides. A student protester wearing a red armband confronted a law professor who was walking with his wife near the campus gates and punched him in the stomach. Police wielded batons against faculty and reporters as well as protesters. Columbia closed for the remainder of the semester. In late August, anti-war protesters disrupted the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. The day before the convention began, hundreds of protesters assembled in Lincoln Park a mile north of the Loop began heckling and taunting the police, chanting, "Fuck the pigs! Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, NLF is gonna win," National Liberation Front, the political arm of the Viet Cong, and 2468, organize and smash the state. Some of the protesters waving Viet Cong flags. Many of them wore red headbands and carried small backpacks stuffed with Vaseline, gloves, and goggles to protect them from tear gas, a first aid kit, a hammer to smash windows, marbles to scatter before approaching police, and a homemade blackjack fashioned from a piece of garden hose that had a weight jammed into one end and was wrapped outside with electrical tape. Helmeted police, armed with billy clubs, truncheons, and tear gas, charged into the crowd and brutally drove protesters out of the park, sparking a running street battle that lasted well into the night. Skirmishes continued for the next several days, the police wielding batons and the protesters throwing rocks and bottles, shouting "Sieg Heil" and "Kill the pigs." The climax, or low point, came on August 28th, when protesters chanting "Fuck you, LBJ" started out from Grant Park toward the International Amphitheater on the night of presidential balloting. At the intersection of Michigan and Balboa Avenues, across the street from the Hilton Hotel, housing convention delegates, a triple line of angry policemen awaited them. Television crews covering the convention recorded the melee that followed. Nightsticks and rocks flew through the air as police tear-gassed demonstrators, reporters, and bystanders, and dragged protesters kicking and screaming. blood running down their faces, to waiting paddy wagons, while the wounded and terrified shouted, "The whole world is watching!"
Sample complete. Ready to continue?